So when Josh and I first came up with the idea for the C3 podcast and starting during a quarantine where none of us could be together, and wanted to just do as much as we can to help out the Element community, the Element family, feel like they're able to hear from their leaders and hear from each other. The first person we thought it had to be Neil. It had to be Neil Perry, and so Neil, I feel like I've been at Element 8 years, and I feel like sometimes I forget some of the key components of how we came about because I wasn't there in the early years, and or the earliest of years. And I'm sure that there's a lot of people who show up at Element on Sunday who don't know much about how we came into existence at all. And so why don't you just take us through kind of how that started for you and how the vision started and how we got to where we are today?
Okay, this may take a few minutes, but man, it goes back all the way, believe it or not, to 2005. I was a youth pastor in Shelby, North Carolina at Putnam Baptist Church, now Pleasant City Church. Incredible church, incredible pastor. Been in youth ministry, I guess, 19, 20 years at that point. Thought I would always be in youth ministry, love student ministry, still do. But went to a church in Atlanta to meet up with one of our mission teams. I just returned from Romania, I think, and was going to meet up with the team in Atlanta. And God had just been stirring in my heart to visit North Point Church there in Atlanta. And it happened on Friday night. God just stirring that in my heart after I got back from Romania and talked to my wife about it. And then Saturday kept feeling led to go to this church. And so Sunday morning, my wife said, "Hey, you need to go." So I got up around 5:30. Drove to Atlanta, got there right at 10:30 for one of their services, walked in, and a guy was speaking about God Has a Dream for Your Life. It was Bruce Wilkinson, the book, The Dream Giver. I'll be honest, when that book came out, I was a little critical about it. I thought, what is this? Dream catcher? What is this? And but didn't know it, but it was a divine appointment for me. In the course of that teaching, he began to talk about from Jeremiah 1:5, God knew you before you were in your mother's womb, and began to teach about God has a dream for your life. And real long story short, at that part, God just spoke clearly that day in only the way that he could. He's never really spoke this clear to me in my life, except for my call to ministry, and said, plant a church in your hometown and a movie theater. Let me clarify. It wasn't an audible voice. Of course, it was louder than that. It was a voice to my heart, and it was so clear. I was on the third row. I'll never forget it, about center and in the center, and God spoke so clearly that day. Well, when I walked out, a big point for me for some reason was when I stepped off the concrete entranceway to North Point and stepped onto the asphalt to the parking lot. I think I really at that point said, okay, God, I hear you clearly. And so, leaving a lot of details out, but came back, sat down with my pastor at that time, Brian Glisson, who I love very much, at Putnam Baptist Church. Went to his office, told him. He said, well, I knew this day was coming. And so right on the heels of that, felt like the Lord clearly said to go through a time of preparation. Talked to Brian about that. So began to visit churches around the country, like Mark Batterson's church in Washington, D.C., churches that lined up with the vision that God had made clear there at North Point, what Element Church would look like. At that time, did not even know the name of the church. I wanted to name the church The Bridge, but of course, we're called Element Church. And by the way, if you don't know the name Element, the dictionary says that an element is different parts or substances coming together to produce a definite result.
Mm-hmm.
When I heard that definition, I knew that, hey, that's what element should be called. Jay Oliver was one of the guys that was helping pray about names, and that's the name he threw out there. I didn't like it. But when I heard the definition, I knew, hey, Element Church would be different people from different walks of life, different races, different backgrounds coming together to produce a definite result. And praise God, that's what Element has become. So just rewinding, visited Mark Batterson's church, visited Seacoast, in other churches and just taking notes, laying out the vision on paper, pretty clearly. And then we launched in 2007. We began our first pre-service. We called them monthly momentum services in October of 2007. I believe that's right. I'm horrible with dates, but October 2007. And then we had 4 pre-services. And so October, November, December, January, we officially had our first service February of 2008 at the foundation at Isothermal Community College. And then, I'm sorry. Yes, that is correct. And then we had to move out of there and went to RS Central High School. And so after that, at RS Central High School, we were there for getting close to a year. And they decided that we had a great relationship. Principals were coming, some teachers were coming from RS Central and had a great relationship there. But they felt like that we needed to move out of there at that time. We didn't know where we were going to go, but that's where God began to use the elders of Alexander Baptist Church. J.R. Blanton, you guys know, is on staff at Element, and he was the teaching elder there at Alexander Baptist at the time. And they had a remnant of people that were there that were left with Alexander Baptist, a great group of people that under the leadership of JR and the elders, they felt like it was time to partner with Element Church. They approached us, and I'm leaving out a lot of details, but they approached us and said, hey, we'd love to come together as one church. We don't care what name's on the building. And so we had some meetings back and forth as Element leadership. We were praying, they were praying. And God, through fasting and praying, just confirmed we were supposed to, come together as one church. Just rewinding, the school board told us we had to be out of RS Central January 11th. It's amazing I remember that date. So we had our first service at Alexander Baptist property, which became Element Church property, on January 4th. Man, we had people in there painting on Friday night before our service. It was an incredible time, a stressful time, but it was an incredible time just to see God at work. And so that's how we began. I mean, so we've been in the Alexander Mills community since then. So.
And so for anybody who actually has been around a little while, when you guys moved in, you moved into what became to be known as North Campus, or the old school gymnasium, right?
That's correct. Actually, we had a service over in the sanctuary and a service in the gym.
Mm-hmm.
A guy named Kyle Sisk and Isaiah, they were a part of that running. We actually ran a fiber optic cable underneath the ground, and we had a service over there. The music was live in both auditoriums.
Yeah.
But the message was on the screen in the South campus, which is where we are now. It was good. It was an experiment, but I'm glad we don't do that anymore.
Neither am I. So when I first came on, it was right around that time, and this is before I was on the teaching team. One of my jobs on Sunday morning was you remember we would have an early service in North. This is after live stream. So we would have an early service in North. And since we weren't live streaming, we would record the early service at North on a DVD. And then we would alternate. If the first Sunday of the month, the live teacher would be at South Campus, you would have the recording in the second service at North. And then the next week it would switch. And so the second service, the live teacher the next week would be at North, and we would take the recording, the DVD, and run it across. And sometimes, especially, if a sermon went long, you would have to run that DVD to the guys at South Campus so that they could load the sermon. Do you remember that?
I've tried to forget that.
Yeah, that was wild. And then the crazy thing is, so if you were preaching the early service, you'd have to. I always tell people you would preach to the future, because you would say, like, hey, good morning. And then you'd say, good morning to the people who are watching this at South Campus at 10:30 or whatever the time was. It was a trip, dude. I don't miss that at all. I don't miss that at all.
Me either. Hey, my mind just went, I think I said something incorrectly. We actually had our monthly momentum services at the foundation. Our first service we launched at RS Central. Yeah, Isaiah is much better at dates than I am, but I'm pretty confident that's the thing.
Okay. Well, we'll forgive you on any incorrections.
Yeah.
That's cool. One thing that was super interesting. So the bridge, why did you like the name The Bridge?
Because I'd always, for years, talked about with student ministry, hey, let's build bridges. I had this sermon. I've actually preached at an Element Church, and the bridge is still over in the old 2-story.
Yeah, we did a series.
I remember the bridge series.
I was big on, man,
music choices for that series.
That's right. I was big, man, with student ministry saying, hey, let's build bridges to people far from God, lost people. How can you build a bridge? And we're still like that, as we still talk about that a lot as a church and as individuals. But I just like the name, man, because I wanted to be a church that really was intentional to build bridges to people far from God, not become a holy huddle. And so I like the bridge, man. I'll tell you another one, man. Forest Town, but TOWNE. Forest Town Community Church. Oh yeah, that was gonna be a good one. That was
I didn't know that. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, man.
Forest
that's
Town Community Church.
That doesn't sound like a name that you would have come up with.
I know, but I don't know.
That sounds like something I would have come up with.
Yeah, I can't remember. We had some guys. We were all just throwing out names. But the bridge I was pretty set on the bridge, man. But Element, again, when I heard the definition.
Really?
Matter of fact, when Jay Oliver called me and said, hey, man, what about Element Church? I was like, no way, dude. No way. That's horrible.
Have you ever found, so I've known you for 8 years now, so, I find that that's usually how things go with you. Do you realize that? Like, we come to you with ideas, and then we say, hey, what do you think about this? And the stuff that you hate usually ends up being what we do.
Yeah.
Because you always go, man, I hate that. And then 3 days later, you'll call me and say, hey, man, I was thinking more about that. And
right.
I think I like it.
Yeah.
You're easy.
That's cool.
Sort of like the name change that we're moving towards right now with Element, right? I'm just kidding.
No.
Just kidding. That was a joke.
Very much so.
Oh, man.
So, Josh, I sense that you like the bridge or you don't like the bridge.
Man, I mean, it's all right. I mean,
just say, all right. Translation. I know you now. All right means I hate it.
Well, now it's like I feel like that's a pretty common name for churches. I think now
is it
the bridge?
Like the Bridge Church, the Bridge. I think that's like a lot of Acts 29 churches and stuff like that.
But Neil, like you like sticky statements. I always figured like the name that you would have in like the back of your mind was going to be like, I don't know, Christ Celebration Community Church, because it's all like 4 C's, Honestly, though, question. So I feel like in the life of my ministry at Element, I've spent more time ministering than I have anything, but a close second is moving things. And a lot of that has to do with our executive pastor, JR. But through all that moving, I've seen a lot of stuff that has 4 C's instead of what we know now as the 3 C's. What was the 4th C? Well, first thing, if you want to go into like what the 3 C's are for people who may not 100% know, and then like, was there a 4th C at one point?
Not in the beginning. There was at one point. I'll come to that. It's wild. I remember driving back from Atlanta, and I called 2 people, and but as I was driving back from Atlanta back in 2005, again, the Lord it was almost like drinking from a fire hose, but able to drink every drop. I mean, God was just laying out the vision. And Celebrate, Connect, and Care, God gave us that driving back from Atlanta. But I forget what year, Jeremy, you may remember, but Element, well, I guess it was around 2010, because we moved to the Alexander property. And when we moved to the Alexander property, again, we were in that old gym, and from January 11th to about June, I remember it. We went from about 120 people to 600 people. It was crazy. I remember the day when we had 600 people, and a friend of mine, Brad and Joyce Lapo, I walked around to come into the back door to go up and preach, and I saw somebody's back on the back door. I mean, they were sitting at the back door. That's the only place for a seat. And so God, especially for this area, God was really blessing spiritually and also numerically. And Jeff Sundell, a friend of mine that many of us know, he had been on the mission field in Nepal and India. And man, we met to eat at McDonald's at Gardner Webb, at McDonald's and Gardner Webb. And he began to share some things with me. We'd had some conversation when he came in for furlough like a year before or 6 months before. But man, I was just drawn to the house church movement internationally. And he began to talk about how they made disciples and the church planting movement internationally. And man, it just struck a chord in my heart, really, because at that moment I just began to weep, man. I know I'm an emotional guy, but there in McDonald's, I got emotional. And because the Holy Spirit said to me personally, that Element had made it about butts and seats, not about making disciples. And that's the way the Lord put it on my heart very clearly. And so we began to change some things pretty aggressively, too aggressively, honestly. And so, but we wanted to say, hey, we want to be a church that makes disciples. Actually, we changed our vision statement back then. I can't remember what it was originally. We always said, man, Element Church exists to reach people far from God, but I can't remember the next part of that originally. But we really prayed and talked about it, and came up with the whole and developed Reproducing Disciples One Life at a Time. I'll be honest, I didn't like that either because it's not sticky, but I felt like the Lord was saying, hey, man, that it doesn't have to be sticky. We need to make disciples. So that's where our mission changed to say, hey, Element Church exists to reach people far from God and develop Reproducing Disciples One Life at a Time. So on the heels of that, with all that going on, I remember being somewhere with Jeff Sundell. I think some other people were there. And Jeff Sundell said, with reproducing discipleship, when it gets to the fourth generation, it's explosive. And man, again, my sticky brain said, I'm hearing C4. Well, C4 is an explosive. And Jeff and I began to talk about that. And again, I think some other people were there. And a big term in the international church planting, disciple making movement was catalytic churches. And so we added at that time, a fourth C was to be catalytic. I'll just say, I think that was okay at the time. Again, I was being pretty aggressive, and we as leadership were just trying to be aggressive to say, hey, we want to make disciples. So I'm okay with at that time that we added catalytic, but I feel like that because of making that aggressive change, I'm not saying everything that I especially did during that time was right. It wasn't. I was a little too aggressive, but I think because of that, we, being catalytic became a part of our DNA, and what I mean by that is being a church that wants to make disciples, that makes disciples, that makes disciples. That's part of our DNA now. And so that's why we shifted back to saying, hey, let's simplify. We're going to be about C3, celebrate, connect, and care. If you become a part of all those, you will be catalytic. You know what I'm saying? You'll be a catalyst for change. Yeah. And so,
yeah, it was, I mean, because I came in right after the change, and it was like walking into a war zone, because there's a lot of people who just didn't understand what it was that you were trying to do. Even I didn't understand. It took me years to really understand, okay, what's our DNA? What are we trying to do? And it got to the point where it was like we had too many people who the fourth C was a stumbling block for. It seemed like they were like, well, I'm just going to do that. I'm just going to do Catalyst. Or they would say, so you're telling me if I celebrate, connect, care, that's not enough, you know? And it was just like, it got to the point where we realized it's better caught than taught, you know, that like somebody who is going to be catalyst, it don't matter if it's in the slogan or not, you know? And so that was a big change, I remember, but it was a good change. I feel like moving back to C3.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I remember sitting in a coffee shop, Small Town Roasters in Rutherfordton, with a couple that had just started visiting Element. They'd moved away from here now. The husband had just started working at Facebook, and they were asking the vision of Element. And I was explaining Celebrate, Connect, and Care. When I got to Catalytic, it was like it stalled.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was like, and I think the lady said something like, "So you mean if we do all that, Celebrate, Connect, and Care, there's more?" You know?
Yeah.
And that's when I personally began to realize, it's become complex, you know. And again, if everybody will do the 3 C's, Celebrate, Connect, and Care, be a part of that, we will be Catalytic, you know.
Whether they realize it or not.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Well, I guess like for somebody who, I mean, of course we understand your role, me and Jeremy, but like somebody looking at the leadership structure of Element Church, they might kind of be like, okay, so you have like 3 teaching pastors, and you have like this large staff, and it's kind of like hard to differentiate like what is everybody's role. So like when you think of Neil, like what is like your role, like your week to week, your day to day, as far as like in the like what's going on at Element? Like, how would you describe that?
My role personally?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, man, it's changed over the years, and I didn't intend for it to. If you don't mind, well, I'll say right now, and a lot of people that are listening, they don't even know this. We've not advertised this. We're letting it sort of organically happen, and it is. But my official title, not that we care about that, but titles communicate what we do, is sort of vision and directional pastor. And I'm going to give you a history on that too here in just a second, going all the way back to 2005. But and let me explain, that doesn't mean that all vision comes from me. I say that a lot, man. Vision comes from all of the leadership and all of the body, you know, and I think that happens. And I think that's part of our DNA. And I'm proud of that Element's like that. So I do not believe that all vision comes through one man. I think that's baloney, to be honest with you. And so, but I feel like that is where Jeff Sundell said it to me like this. He one day he asked me, he said, "Man, if I hold a peach seed in my hand, what do you see?" And I thought, I got this. He thinks I'm just going to say a peach seed, but I said, I see a peach tree. He goes, "I think you see an orchard." Don't know why. We were laughing, talking about I was gonna get emotional. I didn't think it'd be on that, but man, that's it's wild, man. I'll say this: the reason, I don't know why I'm getting emotional, but the reason I'm getting emotional is Element Church in 2020 is where. And again, it's not about me at all. I'm just saying that it's finally where I saw it being back in 2005. And because that is what gets me up in the morning, is to see the orchard. Just seeing a peach seed and a peach tree, which God has placed people in our leadership and in his body that are those type of people, and they are so valuable. I mean, tremendously valuable. It can't happen without that. But just seeing a peach seed and a peach tree, that doesn't get me up in the morning. Seeing the orchard, and that's what gets me up in the morning. And that may not make sense to some people, but I think visionaries and a lot of people listening are. A lot of our leadership are. It's not just one visionary. I can't reiterate that enough. But Joe Sundail that day was saying to me, man, there's apostolic gifting in you. You need to walk in that. And I'm very humbled by that. And there's a lot of people in our leadership, in our body, that have that apostolic gifting. And again, to simplify what that means is people that see an orchard, you know, and orchard people can frustrate the people that God has called and gifted to not just manage the tree, but to make the tree what God wants it to be, you know. And then the orchard people can be frustrated by the tree people, but all are valuable. And it just goes back, Paul saying that all the members of the body are so important and everybody has different roles. So to go back to your question, I'm good at making short stories long, but going back to your question, man, when 2005, when I came back, sat in Brian Glisson's office, my pastor at that time, still is my pastor for me, in my heart, and said, I began to share the vision. And one part of that was I wasn't going to have this title, lead pastor, senior pastor. Just me personally, I don't like those titles, because it communicates there's one pastor, and that's not. If there's any pastors listening right now, your youth pastor is a pastor. He's not a director. And I just want to encourage you with that. He's a youth pastor. He's a student pastor. And so I don't like that whole thinking of there's one pastor in a church. And so I pushed against that, but I felt led of God in that early stage of wanting to communicate that. So prayed about it, did some research. I think it actually came to my heart at Mark Batterson's church that my title, for lack of a better word, would be directional pastor. Well, I sat down with Brian, and Brian in his wisdom said, hey man, just encourage me, that may not work, blah, blah. I disagreed with him in my heart, but I found out he was right and he was wrong. That there was a need, there was a season that there needed to be a lead pastor, a senior pastor, and God had called me to be that in the early days of Element. And I pushed against that to a fault, I think, sometimes. But Element's now entered a season to where, I'm not the lead pastor. I'm one of them. And that I am the vision and directional pastor. And man, again, that gets me up in the morning, man. Not meaning I don't teach, I don't preach, not meaning that I don't do other things, but that is, I feel like, where God has called me in the life of Element. And so I don't know if that makes sense. Y'all can ask some questions or add to that. So.
Well, I think, I tell people, and I think I've told you, is like, it's sometimes I've referred to as like Peter among the apostles. Like Peter was never given a title as like, head apostle. But the other apostles, if you look at Acts 15, like it was Peter who stood up and said, I'm going to make this decision. And that's often how our leadership structure is, that like you've always deferred. I mean, I remember when I came on as student pastor, I was very much part-time, very much unpaid. If you can be very much unpaid, but like, I don't know how you make a zero bigger, but it was a big zero, and, but even then, like there was a lot of authority deferred to me in not just in the area of student ministry. I was allowed to speak into areas that weren't mine. And so I think even, especially now where we're a little bit more structured now, things, so our titles, so all three of us have titles at Element Church, but there's weeks where the majority of my work and my time has nothing to do with missions and mobilization, and Josh, there's a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with care team or the college ministry, so it's like, there's an equality. But at the end of the day, even amongst yourself, JR, and myself, a lot of times we defer to you, and part of that is because at the end of the day, there was one person who stepped their foot off at North Point, and that was you. So like sometimes it is important for us to say, okay, does this fit into what you see or what you saw? Because like you said, now you're seeing a vision from, gosh, like what, 12, 13 years ago now, 15 years ago, really, 2005, whenever the first vision of church planting came into your heart. So it's almost like you're seeing a realization of that now. And so even though you're very liberal and generous in how you let us lead, a lot of times it is, okay, does this fit into what you still see from 2005 and 2007 and 2011 and so on and so on and so on. So there's an equality there that we all feel in leadership, but ultimately at the same time, and it can frustrate you, I know, of just, we still view you as Peter among the apostles, you know? And so the titles at Element sometimes don't mean as much as they do other places.
Hey, and I'll go back to something you said, which was powerful, is you guys deferring to me, but also I think something that's big, a part of the DNA of the leadership of Element Church is mutual submission. You know, that there's times when I defer to Justin, or we defer to Justin, or to Isaiah, or to Josh, or Jake, or whoever. And I feel like that, again, I encourage pastors and leaders to be willing to be mutually submissive. Don't make it about the title. You know what I'm saying? And I feel like that's a part of our DNA. I think you guys would agree that mutual submission is a part of who we are.
Well, I think, for me, especially like being at it now for a while, and then just getting a little bit older, so now there's a younger generation, younger than me now, is like, there's a lot of power. And I've learned this from you. I mean, I'm not just trying to make you feel good, but like, I've learned this from you doing it to me, is like when one of the guys comes to me or comes to you with an idea, it's like a lot of times we just say, hey, you're the one who leads that ministry. Like, even if I'm not sure I like the idea, you're the one who leads that ministry. So let's do it. And sometimes it falls flat on its face. Sometimes it doesn't. And there's a lot of power in that, of just being like, hey, if you feel like God's called you to lead, we're going to let you lead, so, but at the same time, speaking in as elders, and whatnot. But, well, hey man, just as we finish up, and, we'll have to have you come back again soon, because there's a lot more we can talk about. If there is anybody who was watching or listening, whether it's in the middle of this quarantine or 10 years from now, they find this, on Facebook or something. If you were talking to a church planter who is in the same phase that you were in 2005 or 2007, what's like the number one thing that you would encourage them with, or like strategic advice? Maybe something, if there is something you would have done differently, I don't know. But what's the number one thing you would say to a guy who's thinking about church planting now?
Oh man, it's a tough one in a way, but I guess so many things go through my mind. That's what makes it tough. But the first thing that I feel like the Holy Spirit just stirred in my heart as you were asking the question was one, that mutually submissive, is a big deal. But also, and this didn't come from me, this came from John Maxwell, but it's really the way I've tried to function as a leader, is one, recognize you have weaknesses. I'll never forget that day in Atlanta, Bruce Wilkinson said that. He said, God has created us with strengths and weaknesses. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. God created us with weaknesses. I'd never thought about that before. But if we all had the same strengths, we're strong in every area, we couldn't be parts of the body. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so that was freeing for me that day to realize, man, I have weaknesses. I knew I did. But stepping into a leadership role like God was saying to do, to plant a church, all the weaknesses were going through my head, my communication skills, my lack of leadership skills, all these things going through my head. And what I learned from that, and what I've tried to do as a leader, and I encourage church planters or whoever to do this, is surround yourself with people that are strong where you're weak. Mm-hmm. And don't be afraid to surround yourself with people that have greater gifting than yourself. I don't know, man. It's something, it's only how God can do it supernaturally, but it's like the more you esteem others higher than yourself, and I'm not good at this all the time, but I'm saying I'm encouraging church planters and all of us, man, to esteem others higher than ourselves. And somehow in the midst of that, God exhorts you even greater. It's crazy. And I don't even know if I'm making sense
you are.
at all on that. But again, I guess narrowing it down, what would I say? It's the word I heard John Maxwell say years ago. And surround yourself with people that are strong where you're weak. I've got a lot of weaknesses, but I feel like God has placed people in my life that are strong where I'm weak, and I feel like where they may be weak, I'm strong, and that's what makes us a team, you know. So.
Yeah. Well, yeah, man. Well, and as one of the people, and Josh is the same, who's served with you, and you're definitely strong where I'm weak, and there's a counterbalance in amongst our staff, and Element's definitely, it'd be hard to copy Element or reproduce Element, intentionally, but I do think that we're onto something here, and I'm excited to see what happens here in the next few years. I'm excited to see what happens in the next couple of months as we navigate, whatever's going to happen with this quarantine and all that. But yeah, man. Well, hey, Josh and I are really glad that you were able to appease us and be our first guest. But I think we'll have to do it again sometime in the near future and dive into some other stuff, because this is probably the shortest conversation I've ever had with you.
Hey, that's right.
I think seriously, I think my wife reminds me every once in a while. I think I've had like a 6-hour phone conversation with you one time. So
yeah,
that doesn't sound unusual though, does it?
I have a lot of those.
I think Neil heard that and was like, "That's a rookie number."
Yeah, yeah. My phone's died on the phone with you from a full charge. So
that's funny. Funny. No, I appreciate you guys doing this. Appreciate you guys.
Yeah, man. Well, hey, we appreciate you too, and
I'll even go so far to say as I love you guys.
Oh well, I'm not.
Y'all don't have to sit back. I do. You can say, well, you can say what Critter, my friend Critter, who's a missionary friend of mine. He was in youth ministry also, and I'll never forget it. He was stepped out on his porch telling one of his youth bye, and this youth was real cool, like Josh, and just real cool guy. But he turned his hat sideways. He was like a rapper kid, I thought he was. And the kid gets to his car, and Critter says, "Hey, I love you, man." And he gets ready to open his door, and he looks back at Critter, and he says, "Hey, Critter, ditto on that love thing." So y'all can say that.
I think I'd rather just say I love you too.
Yeah, I'm not that cool.
Yeah,
I'm definitely not that cool. I gotta pull that one off.
Yeah. Well, I love you too, man, and we'll have to do it again.
All right. See you.
Thanks.